September 17th, 1994. A crisp autumn evening settled over Lakewood Creek, Texas, a town where everyone seemed to know each other by name. The small community, home to West Texas State University, was preparing for the upcoming homecoming weekend. Campus lights illuminated the nearly empty parking lots, as most students had already left for dinner or returned to their dormitories. All except for one. Amber Rain, 19, a sophomore with ambitious plans and a bright future, was last seen leaving the Dillard Science Building at approximately 7:35 p.m. Security footage captured her walking toward parking lot C, where her 1992 blue Honda Civic was later found untouched. Her textbooks were still neatly arranged on the passenger seat. Her keys were missing. Amber herself had vanished without a trace. "It was unusual from the very beginning," recounted Sheriff Dale Matheson, who served as the initial responding officer. "We had a young woman who followed a consistent routine. She attended her classes diligently, worked part-time at the campus library, and maintained regular contact with her family. Then suddenly, nothing. No calls, no activity on her credit cards, no sightings." The morning after her disappearance, Amber's roommate, Stephanie Weller, reported her missing after she failed to return to their shared apartment. According to Weller, Amber had mentioned staying late to discuss a research opportunity with a professor, but she expected her back by 9 p.m. at the latest. Amber wasn't the type to just take off, Weller told investigators. She had an organic chemistry exam the next morning that she'd been studying for all week. She wouldn't have missed it. The initial investigation revealed a disturbing reality. The security cameras covering the route from the science building to parking lot C had a 4-minute blind spot, a gap in surveillance created by the positioning of the cameras and the shadow cast by the old oak trees lining the pathway. Those 4 minutes would become the focus of an investigation spanning nearly 3 decades. Within 24 hours of her disappearance, the case had captured the attention of the tight-knit community. Students and faculty organized search parties that combed through the university grounds and surrounding areas. Flyers with Amber's photograph, showing a young woman with shoulder-length auburn hair and a distinctive silver pendant in the shape of a microscope, appeared throughout Lakewood Creek and neighboring towns. The Rain family arrived from their home in Lubbock, establishing a command center in a local motel. Catherine Rain, Amber's mother, became the public face of the search, making emotional pleas on local television stations. "Amber is our only daughter," she said during one press conference, her voice steady despite her evident distress. "She worked so hard to get into West Texas State's science program. Someone must have seen something that night. Please, if you know anything at all, come forward." As investigators dug deeper into Amber's life, they discovered she had recently made a significant academic change. After initially declaring English literature as her major, she had switched to chemistry at the beginning of the fall semester. This change had come as a surprise to her family, but aligned with her growing interest in pharmaceutical research. Detective Mason Blackridge, a veteran officer with the Lakewood Creek Police Department, was assigned as the lead investigator. Known for his methodical approach and unwavering dedication, Blackridge began by reconstructing Amber's final known movements. "We established that Amber attended her advanced chemistry lecture from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m., Blackridge noted in his case files. "She stayed behind briefly to speak with someone, presumably a professor or fellow student. Then she exited the building at 7:35 p.m., according to the security footage. Her car remained in Lot C, but there was no evidence she ever reached it." The investigation turned to Amber's academic life. Interviews with her classmates revealed she had become increasingly excited about a special research project, though she had been unusually secretive about the details. She mentioned it was potentially groundbreaking, recalled Leslie Donovan, a fellow chemistry student. "She said it could change her entire career trajectory, but she wouldn't tell us what it was about or who she was working with. She just said it was confidential for now." This information led Blackridge to request access to Amber's academic records and email correspondence. However, the university administration initially hesitated, citing privacy concerns and institutional policies. This delay would later be scrutinized as a critical misstep in the early investigation. While waiting for the university to release the records, Blackridge and his team focused on other avenues. They examined Amber's phone records, which showed her last call was to her mother at 4:15 p.m., a routine check-in where she mentioned her evening plans to study after class. Her bank accounts showed no unusual activity, and her passport remained in her apartment drawer. As days turned into weeks, the case developed troubling patterns common to disappearances that end tragically. The media attention gradually waned. The search parties grew smaller. The once bustling command center became quieter as the reality of limited leads set in. By October, the investigation had yielded few concrete results. Amber's professors all reported normal interactions with her, though several noted her exceptional interest in advanced chemical compounds and research methods beyond the scope of undergraduate studies. One significant development came when investigators finally gained access to Amber's university email account. In the weeks before her disappearance, she had exchanged several messages with an account identified only as NV Research. The correspondence referenced meeting times and vague mentions of the project, but contained no specific details about the nature of the research or the identity of NV. "We tried tracing the account," Blackridge explained. "It was created through the university system, but set up in a way that made it difficult to link to a specific faculty member. The IT department determined it was accessed exclusively from campus computers, primarily in the chemistry department." Another potential lead emerged when Amber's notebook was found in her apartment. The final pages contained shorthand notes about chemical compounds and what appeared to be a meeting schedule. One entry, dated for the day of her disappearance, simply read, "Lab C156, 7:45 p.m., demonstration." ATU. When investigators checked Lab C156, they found it meticulously clean, with no evidence of recent use. The lab sign-in sheet for that evening showed no entries after 5 p.m., when the undergraduate labs officially closed. However, faculty members had access to the labs at all hours using their university key cards. By December 1994, the investigation had developed a troubling hypothesis. Amber had likely arranged to meet someone connected to the university for a research-related matter, and this meeting had somehow led to her disappearance. Without a body or crime scene, however, the case remained classified as a missing person investigation rather than a homicide. The university's winter break came and went. Students returned to campus in January, and Amber's disappearance became part of the school's somber history. Her parents maintained a small apartment in Lakewood Creek, unwilling to leave the town where their daughter was last seen. As winter turned to spring, the investigation continued, but with diminishing resources and mounting frustration. Blackridge requested credit card and employment records for all chemistry department faculty, looking for anyone who might have suddenly left town or made unusual purchases around the time of Amber's disappearance. This approach yielded nothing immediately suspicious. What the investigators didn't know then, what would take years to discover, was that the key to solving Amber's disappearance was hidden in plain sight, in the academic records of a respected professor whose quiet departure from the university would eventually prove to be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire case. By March 1995, 6 months after Amber vanished, the active investigation had slowed considerably. The Lakewood Creek Police Department maintained that the case remained open, but new leads had become scarce. Detective Blackridge had compiled an extensive case file, but found himself revisiting the same evidence with diminishing returns. What the investigation needed was something new, something that would break the case wide open and finally answer the question that had haunted Lakewood Creek for half a year. What happened to Amber Rain? That answer would come from an unexpected source, in a remote canyon where the secrets of that September night had been hidden beneath the Texas soil. The discovery that would reignite the Amber Rain investigation came on March 26, 1995, when a group of geology students ventured into Copper Canyon for a weekend field study. Located approximately 30 miles northwest of Lakewood Creek, the rugged terrain had become a popular site for the university's Earth Science program due to its diverse geological formations. "We were collecting soil samples near the Eastern Ridge," recalled Dr. Martin Torres, the geology professor who led the expedition. "One of my students, Kyle Brennan, wandered about 50 yards off the main path and called out that he'd found something unusual partially exposed by recent rainfall. What Brennan had discovered would change everything. Partially uncovered by erosion from unusually heavy spring rains, human remains lay in a shallow grave beneath a natural overhang. The location was remote enough that it would never have been found without someone venturing well off the established hiking trails." Detective Mason Blackridge was having Sunday breakfast with his family when he received the call. By noon, he had assembled a team at the site, cordoning off a half-mile area around the discovery. The remains were carefully excavated over the next 48 hours by forensic anthropologists from the State Crime Lab. "The moment I arrived at that canyon, I had this feeling," Blackridge later confided to the case files. "After 6 months of searching, I believed we had finally found Amber Rain." The dental records confirmed Blackridge's suspicion 3 days later. The remains were indeed those of the missing student. The discovery transformed the case from a disappearance to a homicide investigation, bringing fresh resources and renewed urgency. Dr. Eleanor Suarez, the medical examiner assigned to the case, determined that Amber had died the same night she disappeared. The condition of the remains was consistent with approximately 6 months of exposure to the elements, accounting for the sheltered nature of the burial site, her report stated. Death likely occurred between 7:30 p.m. and midnight on September 17, 1994. The cause of death presented a puzzling forensic challenge. There were no obvious signs of blunt force trauma or knife wounds. No bullet wounds were evident in the recovered skeletal remains. Instead, Dr. Suarez's team discovered unusual tissue degradation patterns that suggested exposure to a toxic substance. "We conducted extensive toxicology tests," Dr. Suarez explained. "The results identified traces of an unusual organic compound that didn't match any standard substances in our database. Whatever this compound was, it appeared to be experimental in nature and likely caused rapid respiratory failure." This finding shifted the focus of the investigation dramatically. Detective Blackridge immediately returned to the university's chemistry department with a new perspective. The mysterious substance suggested that Amber's death was connected to her academic work, specifically the secretive research project her classmates had mentioned. "We're looking for someone with advanced knowledge of organic chemistry," Blackridge told his investigative team during a strategy session in April 1995. "Someone who had access to experimental compounds and the knowledge to use them. Someone who likely knew Amber through her studies." The list of potential suspects narrowed to faculty members and graduate students in the chemistry department. Blackridge and his team conducted exhaustive interviews with everyone who might have worked with Amber. Most cooperated fully, expressing genuine shock and sorrow at the confirmation of her death. One name repeatedly emerged in these interviews: Professor Nathaniel Vance, a 38-year-old associate professor specializing in organic chemistry. Multiple students mentioned that Amber had shown particular interest in his research and had stayed after his classes to ask questions. Professor Vance was known for selecting promising undergraduates to assist with his research, said Department Chair Dr. Eliza Montgomery. He had mentioned Amber as a potential candidate for his lab group, though I wasn't aware that any formal arrangement had been made. When detectives attempted to interview Vance, they made a significant discovery. He had taken an unexpected sabbatical in January 1995, just 3 months after Amber's disappearance. According to university records, he had cited personal reasons and requested an immediate leave of absence. The timing raised immediate red flags, noted Detective Sarah Harding, who joined Blackridge's team after the case became a homicide investigation. Here we have a professor who potentially worked with the victim, and he abruptly leaves town just as the investigation is intensifying. A review of Vance's university file revealed an impressive academic background: PhD from MIT, postdoctoral work at Stanford, and numerous publications in prestigious chemistry journals. His research focused on novel organic compounds with potential pharmaceutical applications. Before coming to West Texas State 5 years earlier, he had worked briefly in the private sector for a pharmaceutical company. Blackridge requested access to Vance's campus office and laboratory, which had remained untouched since his departure. The university administration, now fully cooperating with the investigation, granted immediate access. What they found was perplexing. The office had been meticulously cleaned, with research notes and personal items removed. The laboratory similarly showed signs of thorough cleaning. It was as if he'd systematically erased his presence, Harding observed. Most professors who take sabbatical leave their offices relatively intact. Vance's space looked like he never intended to return. Computer forensics specialists examined Vance's university computer, but the hard drive had been wiped clean using specialized software that made data recovery nearly impossible. This level of digital sanitization was unusual for 1995, when such tools were not commonly used by the general public. The investigation turned to tracking Vance's movements after leaving the university. His personnel file listed a home address in Lakewood Creek, but neighbors reported that he had moved out in late December, hiring a professional moving company that loaded his belongings into a truck with out-of-state plates. Financial records showed that Vance had closed his local bank accounts and credit cards. His last paycheck from the university had been directed to a bank in Oregon, but the account had been closed shortly after the transfer cleared. The trail was growing cold. As spring turned to summer, the investigation faced mounting challenges. Without physical evidence directly linking Vance or anyone else to Amber's death, the case relied heavily on circumstantial connections. The toxicology findings remained inconclusive, as the unknown compound had degraded significantly in the months between Amber's death and the discovery of her remains. In a critical breakthrough, investigators located the laboratory sign-in logs for September 1994. These physical records, stored in the department's archives, showed that Vance had accessed his research laboratory on the evening of September 17th, the night Amber disappeared. His entry was logged at 7:15 p.m. and no exit time was recorded, suggesting he either forgot to sign out or deliberately left this information blank. This placed him on campus at the right time, Blackridge noted, but we still needed to establish a direct connection between him and Amber that night. The investigation returned to the mysterious NV Research email account that had communicated with Amber. While the account name suggested a connection to Nathaniel Vance, technicians could not definitively link it to him due to the university's limited email tracking capabilities in 1994. By August 1995, Detective Blackridge had assembled a circumstantial case. Amber had likely been involved in research with Professor Vance, had arranged to meet him the night she disappeared, and had died from exposure to an unusual chemical compound potentially related to his research. Vance had subsequently left the university and appeared to be deliberately covering his tracks. What the investigation lacked was definitive evidence. No eyewitnesses placed Amber and Vance together that night. No physical evidence connected him to the burial site, and the exact nature of the toxic substance remained unidentified. The district attorney reviewed the case file and concluded that while Vance was certainly a person of interest, the evidence was insufficient to issue an arrest warrant or to confidently present the case to a grand jury. Without knowing Vance's whereabouts, pursuing him across state lines would require substantial resources that the small department couldn't justify without stronger evidence. In September 1995, 1 year after Amber's disappearance, her family held a memorial service in Lakewood Creek. Catherine Rain, who had remained in town throughout the investigation, spoke briefly about her daughter's dreams and the injustice of her death. Detective Blackridge attended, sitting quietly in the back row of the chapel. "I promise you," he told Catherine after the service, "this case will not be forgotten. Someday we will find the answers." Despite Blackridge's determination, the practical realities of police work gradually took precedence. New cases demanded attention, resources were reallocated, and the active investigation into Amber's death slowly transitioned to cold case status. By December 1995, the case was officially classified as inactive pending new evidence. NAPE, the file containing everything known about Amber Rain's life, disappearance, and death, was carefully archived. It would sit untouched for more than 2 decades, waiting for advances in forensic science and a fresh perspective to breathe new life into the investigation. What no one could have predicted was that the quiet disappearance of Professor Nathaniel Vance was just the beginning of a carefully constructed new identity, one that would eventually unravel through a combination of scientific progress, dedicated police work, and the simple fact that secrets, no matter how well buried, rarely remain hidden forever. For 23 years, the evidence in Amber Rain's case lay dormant in the Lakewood Creek Police Department storage facility. Cardboard boxes containing soil samples from Copper Canyon, clothing fragments, and microscope slides with degraded tissue samples gathered dust alongside hundreds of other unsolved cases. The department's limited resources meant cold cases rarely saw daylight unless new evidence emerged or witnesses came forward. For Amber Rain, neither had happened. Catherine Rain never gave up hope for justice. Every year, on the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance, she would call Detective Blackridge, who had since risen to become chief of detectives. Their conversations followed a familiar pattern. He would update her on the status of the case, unchanged, and she would thank him for not forgetting her daughter. By 2018, these calls had become a solemn tradition that neither was willing to break. "I think about her case every day," Blackridge confided to his wife after Catherine's call in September 2018. "It's the one that got away, the one I couldn't solve." What Blackridge didn't know was that across town, a new initiative was about to change everything. In January 2018, the Lakewood Creek Police Department had received a substantial grant from the state of Texas to establish a cold case unit, dedicated to revisiting unsolved murders using modern forensic techniques. The program was part of a statewide effort to address a backlog of unresolved homicides dating back decades. Detective Trent Calloway, a 15-year veteran with specialized training in forensic science and cold case methodology, was appointed to lead the new unit. At 42, Calloway had built a reputation for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to see connections others missed. He had previously worked with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit and had returned to his hometown of Lakewood Creek to be closer to his aging parents. "When I first arrived, I requested a list of all unsolved homicides from the past 30 years, Calloway recalled. Amber Rain's case immediately stood out, not just because of the unusual circumstances, but because the file was so comprehensive. Blackridge had done exceptional work documenting every aspect of the investigation. In February 2018, Calloway officially reopened the Amber Rain case. His first step was to review every document, photograph, and piece of evidence collected during the original investigation. He spent 2 weeks immersed in the case files, constructing a detailed timeline and relationship chart covering the key players. "I wanted to approach this with fresh eyes," Calloway explained, "but I also needed to understand what the original investigators were thinking and what avenues they had already explored. The most promising aspect for a modern reinvestigation was the unidentified toxic compound found in Amber's remains. In 1995, the technology to analyze such degraded samples had been limited. By 2018, advances in mass spectrometry and chemical analysis offered new possibilities. Callaway's first significant decision was to send the preserved tissue samples to the Advanced Forensic Science Laboratory at the University of Texas. Dr. Riya Patel, a forensic toxicologist specializing in cold cases, led the analysis. The samples were significantly degraded after more than 2 decades in storage, Dr. Patel noted in her report. However, using high-resolution mass spectrometry, we were able to identify structural components of the compound that weren't detectable with 1990s technology. Boo! While the analysis couldn't completely reconstruct the compound, it provided crucial information. The substance contained a unique molecular signature consistent with a class of experimental neurotoxins that had been studied in the early 1990s for potential pharmaceutical applications before being abandoned due to safety concerns. This wasn't something available commercially, Dr. Patel emphasized. The compound would have required sophisticated knowledge of organic chemistry and access to a well-equipped laboratory to synthesize. We're talking about someone with advanced training in chemical synthesis. This finding reinforced the original investigation's focus on the chemistry department at West Texas State University. Callaway decided to dig deeper into the background of Professor Nathaniel Vance, who remained the primary person of interest, despite never having been officially charged. Vance essentially vanished after leaving the university, Callaway discovered. The original investigation tracked him to Oregon based on a bank transfer, but the trail went cold after that. No credit history, no tax records, no property ownership under that name for over 2 decades. Callaway's approach to cold cases involved what he called parallel construction, examining what was known about the crime while simultaneously building a new investigation using modern resources. Rather than simply following the original detective's path, he looked for angles they might have missed or been unable to pursue due to technological limitations. One such angle was DNA evidence. In 1995, DNA testing was still in its early stages and required relatively large, well-preserved samples. By 2018, techniques had advanced dramatically, allowing analysis of microscopic and degraded samples. The clothing fragments recovered with Amber's remains had never been tested for DNA, Callaway noted. They were too degraded for the methods available in 1995, but I believed we might get results with modern techniques. He sent the preserved clothing fragments to the State Forensic Laboratory, requesting advanced DNA extraction and analysis. While the team worked on this angle, Callaway pursued another modern investigative approach, digital archaeology. Even though this case predated widespread internet use, I wanted to see if there was any digital footprint of Professor Vance that might have been overlooked, he explained. Universities were early adopters of digital systems, and West Texas State had begun computerizing some of their records in the early 1990s. Working with the university's IT department, Callaway discovered archived backup tapes from the old academic system. Most of the data was corrupted or incomplete, but among the recovered files were digital copies of research grant applications submitted by faculty members between 1990 and 1995. One application, submitted by Professor Vance 6 months before Amber's disappearance, detailed a research project involving novel neurotoxic compounds with potential applications as targeted cancer therapies. The molecular structures outlined in the proposal bore striking similarities to the partial compounds identified in Amber's remains. This was our first concrete link between Vance's research and the cause of Amber's death, Callaway said. It established that he was working with compounds that matched what we found in her system. While this discovery strengthened the circumstantial case against Vance, Callaway still faced the challenge of locating him after 23 years. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The DNA analysis of the clothing fragments. We were able to extract several DNA samples from the preserved clothing, reported Dr. Julian Wong, the forensic geneticist who conducted the analysis. Most matched Amber's profile as expected. However, we also found traces of male DNA on the sleeve of what appears to have been her jacket. The sample was highly degraded but sufficient for partial profiling. This partial DNA profile wasn't complete enough to identify a specific individual, but it could be used to exclude or include potential suspects if comparative samples were available. The question was how to obtain Vance's DNA after so many years. Calloway turned to the university's Human Resources Archives. In the early 1990s, West Texas State had briefly experimented with a voluntary biometric identification system for faculty accessing secure laboratories. The system, which recorded fingerprints, was abandoned after 1 year due to privacy concerns and technical limitations. However, the enrollment forms and fingerprint cards had been preserved in personnel files. Vance had enrolled in the system, Calloway discovered. We had his fingerprints on file, which gave us a biometric identifier we could search against national databases. Datum. In April 2018, Calloway submitted Vance's fingerprints to the FBI's Next Generation Identification System, which contained records from law enforcement agencies, employment background checks, and visa applications across the country. The system returned a surprising hit. The fingerprints matched those of a Neil Vernon, who had obtained a commercial driver's license in Portland, Oregon in 2003. That's when everything accelerated, Calloway recalled. We had a current name and location. Nathaniel Vance had become Neil Vernon, but he'd made a critical mistake by providing fingerprints for his commercial license. Further investigation revealed that Neil Vernon had established himself as a chemical industry consultant in Portland. His company, NV Analytical Solutions, provided technical expertise to pharmaceutical manufacturers and research institutions. He had built a respectable business, owned a house in an upscale neighborhood, and had even remarried in 2010. He'd created an entirely new life, Calloway observed, but the timing was the key. Neil Vernon's first documented appearance was in 1996, approximately 1 year after Nathaniel Vance disappeared from Texas. With a current identity and location established, Calloway began constructing a comprehensive case against Vernon Vance. He coordinated with Portland authorities to conduct discreet surveillance, collecting discarded items that might contain DNA samples for comparison with the partial profile from Amber's clothing. In June 2018, the lab confirmed what Calloway had suspected. The DNA recovered from a coffee cup discarded by Neil Vernon was consistent with the partial profile found on Amber's clothing. While not a complete match due to the degraded nature of the original sample, the statistical probability was strong enough to support further action. Calloway presented his findings to the district attorney, who agreed there was now sufficient evidence to pursue charges. However, before making an arrest, they needed to strengthen the case further to ensure a conviction after so many years. We had the who and the how, Calloway explained. But we still needed to establish the why, the motive that would explain why a respected professor would kill a promising student. The answer would come from a deeper examination of Amber's academic work and her relationship with Professor Vance, a relationship that, evidence would soon reveal, extended far beyond the normal boundaries of faculty-student interaction and into dangerous territory that ultimately led to her death. As summer turned to fall in 2018, Calloway meticulously assembled the pieces of this decades-old puzzle, unaware that his investigation was about to uncover a motive even more disturbing than he had imagined, one that would finally bring justice for Amber Rain and closure to a case that had haunted Lakewood Creek for nearly a quarter-century. The breakthrough in establishing motive came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the archived materials from the original investigation, Detective Calloway discovered a small detail that had been overlooked: a storage locker key found among Amber's possessions. The key, labeled only with the number 247, had been catalogued but never connected to a specific location. Sometimes the most significant evidence is hiding in plain sight, Calloway later remarked. This key had been sitting in evidence for 23 years, and no one had determined what it opened. Udaidi, after methodical research through local storage facilities operating in 1994, Calloway identified Secure Store, a facility 2 miles from campus that had been in business since the late 1980s. The facility had changed ownership twice since Amber's death, but remarkably, the current management still maintained the original rental records. Unit 247 was indeed rented to Amber Rain, Calloway confirmed. She had paid for a 6-month rental in advance, beginning in August 1994, just 1 month before her disappearance. On a crisp October morning in 2018, Calloway obtained a search warrant for the storage unit. Accompanied by a forensic team and the current facility manager, he cut the rusted padlock that had remained untouched for more than 2 decades. The unit contained a single item, a fireproof document box secured with a combination lock. After obtaining additional authorization to open the box, Calloway discovered what would become the cornerstone of the case against Nathaniel Vance. Inside were research notes, chemical formulas, and a detailed journal documenting Amber's work with Professor Vance, Calloway explained. But more importantly, it contained evidence that their relationship had become inappropriate and that Amber had discovered Vance was engaged in academic misconduct. The journal entries, spanning from June to September 1994, revealed a troubling progression. Initially, the entries expressed Amber's excitement about being selected for Vance's research team, an unusual opportunity for a sophomore. She described the project as potentially groundbreaking, involving the development of targeted neurotoxins that could attack cancer cells while leaving healthy tissue unharmed. By July, the tone of the entries changed. Amber wrote about feeling uncomfortable with Vance's increasing personal attention. "He keeps finding reasons to meet alone," one entry noted. "Today, he suggested we continue our discussion over dinner at his house. I made an excuse about studying, but he seemed irritated." August entries documented a further shift in their relationship. "I don't know how to handle this situation," Amber wrote. "He says my contribution to the research is vital, that we could publish together, something unprecedented for an undergraduate. But the way he looks at me sometimes, I feel trapped between this amazing opportunity and my growing discomfort." The most damning evidence came in early September when Amber documented a disturbing discovery. "I found my original synthesis notes in his draft paper, word for word, but with no attribution. When I confronted him, he dismissed it as a temporary placeholder and said of course I would receive credit, but I saw the submission form. My name wasn't anywhere on it." The final entry, dated September 16th, the day before her disappearance, outlined Amber's plan to meet with Vance one last time. "I'm giving him an ultimatum tomorrow night. Either he acknowledges my work properly, or I'm taking my documentation to the department chair. I've made copies of everything and secured them off campus. I know this could end my research opportunity, but I can't let him steal my work." This journal provided what the case had lacked for decades: a clear motive. Vance had not only engaged in an inappropriate relationship with his student, but had attempted to plagiarize her research contributions. When confronted, he faced potential professional ruin, a powerful motive for silencing the one person who could expose him. The storage locker was Amber's insurance policy, Calloway theorized. She anticipated potential retaliation and took steps to preserve the evidence. She just never imagined how far Vance would go to protect his reputation. Armed with this new evidence, Calloway expanded his investigation into Vance's academic career before and after the murder. Working with university administrators across the country, he uncovered a pattern of concerning behavior dating back to Vance's time as a graduate student. There were complaints at previous institutions, Calloway found. Nothing that resulted in formal disciplinary action, but several female students had reported uncomfortable interactions. These complaints were typically handled internally and quietly, common practice in academia during that era. Examining Vance's publication record revealed another suspicious pattern. His research output had been relatively modest before coming to West Texas State, where he suddenly published several groundbreaking papers in quick succession. After becoming Neil Vernon, his professional work consisted entirely of consulting rather than original research. It appears that Amber wasn't his first victim of plagiarism, Calloway concluded, just the only one who confronted him directly and paid the ultimate price. By December 2018, Calloway had assembled a compelling case. The evidence now included the partial DNA match linking Vance and Vernon to the crime scene, the toxicology analysis connecting Amber's cause of death to Vance's research, Amber's detailed journal establishing motive, the pattern of professional misconduct and inappropriate behavior, Vance's abrupt departure and creation of a new identity. The district attorney agreed that they had sufficient evidence to seek an indictment. However, prosecuting a decades-old murder case presented unique challenges, particularly across state lines. Calloway worked with federal authorities to ensure proper jurisdiction and extradition procedures. "We needed to be methodical," he explained. "After waiting 24 years for justice, we couldn't risk procedural mistakes that might allow Vance to escape conviction." In January 2019, as preparations for arrest were being finalized, Calloway made one last effort to strengthen the case. He revisited West Texas State University to interview anyone who might have witnessed interactions between Amber and Vance in September 1994. Most faculty members from that era had retired or moved on, but Calloway discovered that Walter Jenkins, a maintenance worker who had been responsible for the science building, still worked at the university. When interviewed, Jenkins provided the final piece of the puzzle. "I remember that night," Jenkins stated in his recorded testimony. "I was working late, fixing a heating issue in the East Wing. I saw Professor Vance and a young woman having an intense conversation in the hallway outside his lab around 8 p.m. They didn't notice me at the far end of the corridor, but I could tell it was heated. She was gesturing with some papers, and he looked, well, I'd never seen him look so angry. He grabbed her arm, then seemed to catch himself and released her. They went into his lab together, and that was the last I saw. I didn't think much of it at the time. Professors and students have disagreements. It wasn't until later, when I heard about the missing student, that I wondered if there was a connection." When asked why he hadn't come forward in 1994, Jenkins explained that he had mentioned it to his supervisor, who told him it wasn't relevant since he hadn't witnessed anything criminal. In the hierarchical university environment of the mid-1990s, a maintenance worker's observations about a professor's behavior were easily dismissed. Jenkins' testimony placed Amber and Vance together at the crucial time, Calloway noted. It corroborated the timeline established by the journal and provided an eyewitness account of their final known interaction. D'accord. With this final piece of evidence, an arrest warrant was issued for Neil Vernon, formerly Nathaniel Vance, on charges of first-degree murder. To ensure the element of surprise and prevent any possibility of flight, Calloway coordinated with the Portland Police Department for a carefully planned arrest. On the morning of January 17, 2019, as Neil Vernon left his suburban Portland home for his daily coffee run, he was surrounded by police vehicles and taken into custody without incident. When informed of the charges, witnesses reported that he showed little reaction beyond asking to speak with his attorney. The arrest made national headlines. Cold case breakthrough. Professor arrested for student's 1994 murder. Catherine Rain learned of the arrest from Detective Blackridge, who called her personally before the news broke publicly. "After all these years," she told reporters, "I never lost faith that someday someone would find the truth. I only wish my husband had lived to see this day." Robert Rain had passed away in 2011, never knowing who had taken his daughter's life. The extradition process moved swiftly, and by early February, Neil Vernon was back in Texas, facing justice in the same county where Amber's life had ended 24 years earlier. He maintained his innocence, with his defense team initially challenging the reliability of evidence after so many years and questioning the chain of custody for the materials found in the storage locker. As the case proceeded toward trial, prosecutors offered Vernon a plea deal, second-degree murder with the possibility of parole after 25 years. He rejected the offer, maintaining that he was not Nathaniel Vance and had no connection to the crime. The stage was set for what would become one of the most closely watched cold case trials in Texas history. After decades of silence, the truth about what happened to Amber Rain on that September night in 1994 would finally be revealed in court, bringing long-delayed justice to a case that had haunted Lakewood Creek for a generation. For Detective Trent Calloway, the investigation represented the culmination of modern forensic techniques and traditional detective work. Cold cases are never truly cold, he reflected. They're just waiting for the right technology and the right perspective to bring them back to life. As 2019 progressed, the prosecution prepared to present their case against the man who had spent nearly half his life believing he had gotten away with murder. The trial would reveal not only the details of Amber's death, but the elaborate efforts Vance had undertaken to escape his past and create a new identity. Efforts that had succeeded for 24 years, but would ultimately fail to outrun justice. The trial of Neil Vernon, formerly Professor Nathaniel Vance, began on September 17, 2019, exactly 25 years to the day after Amber Rain's disappearance. The timing was not coincidental. Prosecutor Elena Vasquez had specifically requested the date, calling it a symbolic step toward closure for a community that has waited a generation for justice. The Lakewood Creek County Courthouse had been renovated several times since 1994, but the main courtroom retained its imposing oak panels and solemn atmosphere. Every seat was filled for the opening statements, with local residents, university students, and media representatives crowding the public gallery. Catherine Rain sat in the front row directly across from the man accused of killing her daughter. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Vasquez began, "this case is about a brilliant young woman who had her future stolen. Not just her life, but her academic work, her ideas, her potential. And it was stolen by a man who was supposed to be her mentor, her teacher, her guide into the world of scientific discovery." Vernon's defense team, led by prominent attorney Marcus Hoffman, countered with a strategy focused on the passage of time and the reliability of evidence. "This case rests on degraded samples, faded memories, and circumstantial connections," Hoffman argued. "The prosecution will ask you to believe that my client, a respected professional with no criminal history, is actually a different person who committed a murder 25 years ago and then masterfully evaded detection until now. We will demonstrate that this extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence which the state simply does not possess." Over the next 3 weeks, the prosecution methodically built their case. The trial revealed details about the investigation that had never been made public, painting a comprehensive picture of both the original crime and Vernon's elaborate efforts to create a new identity. Dr. Riya Patel testified about the advanced toxicology analysis, explaining to the jury how modern technology had identified the compound that caused Amber's death. Using computer animations and molecular models, she demonstrated how the neurotoxin worked, rapidly paralyzing the respiratory system while leaving the victim conscious and aware until death occurred. "This wasn't a quick or merciful death," Dr. Patel testified. "The victim would have been fully aware but unable to move or call for help as her breathing gradually stopped. It would have taken between 10 and 15 minutes, and she would have been conscious for most of that time." The jury visibly reacted to this testimony, several members showing visible distress at the description. Vernon remained impassive, taking notes on a legal pad throughout the proceedings. Detective Calloway spent 2 days on the witness stand, explaining how modern forensic techniques had revealed connections that weren't possible to establish in 1994. He walked the jury through the evidence found in Amber's storage locker, projecting her journal entries onto screens visible to the entire courtroom. Amber Rain knew she was in a dangerous situation, Calloway testified. She took precautions to document what was happening and secure that documentation off campus. She just never anticipated the extreme measures Professor Vance would take to silence her. The defense vigorously cross-examined Calloway, questioning the chain of custody for the storage locker contents and suggesting that anyone could have placed the materials there after Amber's death. They also challenged the partial DNA match, arguing that the degraded sample couldn't conclusively identify their client. On the trial's 7th day, Walter Jenkins took the stand. Now in his 70s, the retired maintenance worker provided compelling testimony about seeing Amber and Vance together on the night she disappeared. "I've carried that memory for 25 years, Jenkins said, his voice steady despite his age. "I've often wondered if I could have done something differently, spoken up sooner, maybe approached them to make sure everything was all right. I never imagined I was witnessing the last moments of that young woman's life." The prosecution also called forensic accountant Sofia Rodriguez, who had traced Vernon's financial history back to 1995. She outlined the careful steps taken to establish his new identity. The closure of accounts in Texas, the movement of funds through multiple banks to obscure their origin, and the eventual establishment of new accounts in Oregon under the name Neil Vernon. This wasn't an impulsive flight, Rodriguez testified. This was a carefully planned disappearance executed over several months. Bank records show that Professor Vance began liquidating investments and transferring small amounts to anonymous accounts approximately 2 weeks after Amber Rain's disappearance, well before he officially left the university. Perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Dr. Eliza Montgomery, the former chemistry department chair, now retired. She revealed that after reopening the investigation, authorities had discovered sealed documents in the university's confidential files. Reports from 2 female graduate students who had complained about Vance's behavior in 1993, just a year before Amber's death. These complaints were handled internally according to the protocols of that time, Dr. Montgomery explained. Professor Vance received a verbal warning, and the incidents were documented but not made public or added to his official personnel file. In retrospect, this was a serious institutional failure that may have contributed to the tragedy that followed. The defense team fought to have this testimony excluded as prejudicial, but Judge Sandra Ortiz allowed it, ruling that it established a pattern of behavior relevant to understanding the relationship between Vance and Amber. As the prosecution's case neared completion, they called their final witness Dr. Lawrence Chen, a former colleague of Vance who had joined the chemistry department the same year. Dr. Chen testified that he had accessed Vance's laboratory the day after Amber's disappearance and had noticed unusual activity. The lab was immaculate, unusually so, Dr. Chen recalled. Nathaniel was generally organized, but this was different. Every surface had been cleaned with solvents, the waste containers had been emptied, the ventilation system had been running at maximum capacity. At the time, I assumed he was preparing for a sensitive experiment. Looking back, I believe he was systematically removing evidence. The defense case relied heavily on challenging the scientific evidence and emphasizing the passage of time. They called their own experts who questioned the reliability of DNA analysis on decades-old samples and the definitive identification of the toxic compound. They also presented character witnesses from Portland who testified to Vernon's reputation as a responsible business owner and community member. Vernon himself chose not to testify, a decision that generated significant media speculation but was standard practice in many criminal trials. His silence allowed the defense to control his narrative without subjecting him to cross-examination. In closing arguments, Prosecutor Vasquez returned to Amber's journal, projecting the final entry onto the courtroom screens. "I'm giving him an ultimatum tomorrow night. Either he acknowledges my work properly, or I'm taking my documentation to the department chair." Those were the last words Amber Rain wrote, Vasquez told the jury. The next day, she confronted a man who had already demonstrated inappropriate behavior toward female students, who was attempting to steal her research, and who faced professional ruin if she exposed him. When faced with this threat to his career and reputation, Nathaniel Vance used his scientific knowledge to commit a perfect murder, or so he thought. He used a compound that he believed would be undetectable, disposed of her body in a remote location, methodically erased his trail, and created an entirely new identity. Defense attorney Hoffman countered with an emotional appeal, questioning the reliability of evidence after so many years. Memories fade. Physical evidence degrades. Documents can be manipulated. After 25 years, can anyone truly be certain beyond a reasonable doubt? The prosecution has shown you a compelling story, but stories are not evidence, and doubt permeates every aspect of this case. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned on October 11, 2019, with their verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. As the foreman read the verdict, Catherine Rain closed her eyes, her shoulders visibly relaxing for perhaps the first time in 25 years. Vernon, who had maintained his composure throughout the trial, finally showed emotion, a brief flash of anger before his face returned to its careful neutrality. His defense team immediately announced their intention to appeal. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Judge Ortiz allowed Catherine Rain to address the court. Her victim impact statement, delivered in a clear voice that occasionally wavered with emotion, brought many in the courtroom to tears. 25 years ago, I lost my only child, not to illness or accident, but to the calculated actions of someone who was supposed to guide and educate her. Amber was brilliant, determined, and honest. She stood up for herself and her work, and it cost her everything. While nothing can bring her back, knowing that justice has finally been served allows me to fulfill the promise I made at her memorial service, that someday, somehow, the truth would come to light. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, Vernon finally broke his silence. In the calm, measured tone that betrayed no remorse, he stated simply, "I maintain my innocence. I am not Nathaniel Vance. This conviction is a mistake that future evidence will correct." Judge Ortiz was unmoved. Citing the calculated nature of the crime, the abuse of position and trust, and the extensive efforts to evade justice, she sentenced Vernon to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty allowed under Texas law for the crime as charged. As Vernon was led from the courtroom, Detective Calloway watched from the back row. For him, the case represented not just the successful resolution of a cold case, but a validation of his belief that advances in forensic science could bring justice even decades after a crime. Technology advances, but human nature remains constant, Calloway later reflected in an interview. People who commit crimes leave traces, physical, digital, financial. They make mistakes, sometimes small ones, that only become apparent years later with new techniques or perspectives. The Amber Rain case proves that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. For the community of Lakewood Creek, the trial and conviction brought a sense of closure to a tragedy that had haunted the town for a generation. West Texas State University established a scholarship in Amber's name for women pursuing degrees in chemistry, with a focus on research ethics and academic integrity. As Neil Vernon began serving his sentence at the maximum security Huntsville State Penitentiary, his attorneys filed the promised appeal, setting in motion a legal process that would extend the case for several more years. What they didn't know was that the final chapter of this story would include one more unexpected revelation, one that would emerge from Vernon's carefully constructed life in Oregon and remove any remaining doubt about his guilt. While Neil Vernon began serving his life sentence at Huntsville State Penitentiary in late 2019, his legal team launched an aggressive appeal process. Led by attorney Marcus Hoffman, they filed a 78-page appeal document citing alleged procedural errors, questioning the admissibility of evidence after so many years, and challenging the scientific validity of the forensic analysis. The appeal process would normally take 12 to 18 months to work its way through the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, but the COVID-19 pandemic that emerged in early 2020 created unprecedented delays in the justice system. The wheels of justice turn slowly, Detective Calloway remarked to Catherine Rain during one of their regular check-ins. But they do turn. Catherine, now in her early 70s, had moved back to Lubbock after the trial, but remained deeply invested in the case. "I've waited 25 years, she replied. "I can wait a little longer to ensure this is truly finished." What neither of them knew was that the final piece of the puzzle was about to emerge from an unexpected source. In April 2021, as pandemic restrictions began to ease in Portland, Oregon, a woman named Elaine Vernon filed for divorce from her husband of 11 years. During the standard discovery process of divorce proceedings, her attorney requested access to all financial records and safety deposit boxes maintained by Neil Vernon. Among the items discovered in a safety deposit box at First Meridian Bank in downtown Portland was a sealed envelope marked "Insurance Policy Do Not Open." Elaine's attorney, suspecting it might contain financial documents relevant to the divorce, obtained court permission to open it. What they found instead was a handwritten confession. The 10-page document, written in September 2018, shortly before Calloway had identified Vernon as Vance, began with the words, "My name is Nathaniel James Vance, formerly a professor of chemistry at West Texas State University. This document is my admission to the murder of Amber Rain on September 17, 1994. The confession detailed how Vance had become increasingly obsessed with Amber after selecting her for his research team, how he had incorporated her breakthrough ideas into his work without attribution, and how he had panicked when she threatened to expose him. I had synthesized a new neurotoxic compound as part of our cancer research, Vance wrote. It was designed to target specific cellular pathways, and I had already tested it on laboratory animals with remarkable efficiency. When Amber confronted me that night with copies of her notes and threatened to go to the department chair, I saw my entire career collapsing. In that moment of panic, I offered her tea laced with a small dose of the compound, enough to paralyze but not kill. I only wanted to frighten her, to make her understand the power I held. The confession continued, describing how the situation had quickly escalated beyond his control. The dosage had been miscalculated, and Amber's respiratory system began shutting down more rapidly than anticipated. Rather than calling for medical help, Vance had watched her die, believing that his career and freedom were worth more than her life. I wrapped her body in a laboratory tarp and placed it in the trunk of my car, the confession detailed. After midnight, I drove to Copper Canyon, a site I knew from department field trips, and buried her beneath an overhang where I thought she would never be found. I spent the next 3 months methodically erasing my existence as Nathaniel Vance and creating Neil Vernon. The document concluded with a chilling rationalization. I have lived with this knowledge for 24 years. I have built a new life, a successful business, a reputation for integrity. I tell myself that one terrible mistake should not define a lifetime. Yet I know that what I did was unforgivable. I write this not seeking forgiveness, but as insurance against any future investigation. If you are reading this, then something has gone wrong with my carefully constructed life. Elaine Vernon's attorney immediately contacted the Portland Police Department, who notified authorities in Texas. Within 24 hours, the confession was in the hands of the Lakewood Creek District Attorney's Office, where Elena Vasquez recognized its significance for the ongoing appeal process. This document fundamentally alters the legal landscape, Vasquez explained in an emergency filing to the Court of Criminal Appeals. The defendant's own written confession, created prior to his arrest and discovered through unrelated civil proceedings, directly contradicts the central argument of his appeal that he is not Nathaniel Vance and has no connection to Amber Rain's murder. The handwriting in the confession was analyzed by forensic document examiners and matched samples of Vance's writing from his time at West Texas State University. Additionally, the paper and ink were determined to be consistent with manufacturing dates from 2018, confirming it was written before his arrest but long after the crime. On June 15, 2021, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals unanimously rejected Vernon's appeal. The three-judge panel cited the newly discovered confession as overwhelming evidence of guilt that renders moot any procedural questions raised in the appeal. They further noted that the confession demonstrates not only guilt, but a calculated and decades-long effort to evade justice, showing no remorse for the crime, but rather regret at being discovered. When informed of the confession, Vernon's appeal attorney, Marcus Hoffman, immediately moved to withdraw from the case. This development represents information that was withheld from counsel, Hoffman stated in his withdrawal filing. The legal team cannot ethically continue representation under these circumstances. Vernon, now irrefutably exposed as Vance, made no further legal efforts to challenge his conviction. His silence from prison was interpreted by many as final acceptance of his guilt and the justice of his sentence. For Catherine Rain, the confession provided a different kind of closure. "All these years, I've wondered about her final moments," she told reporters. "As horrible as it is to know the details, there's a certain peace in finally having the full truth. He didn't just admit to what he did, he admitted to who he is." The discovery of the confession made national headlines, and the case became the subject of several true crime documentaries and podcasts. The story resonated particularly strongly in academic circles, where it sparked renewed discussions about power dynamics between professors and students, the pressures of academic publishing, and the institutional safeguards necessary to prevent similar tragedies. West Texas State University expanded the Amber Rain Memorial Scholarship to include funding for ethics training for faculty and students. They also established an anonymous reporting system for academic misconduct and inappropriate behavior, directly addressing the institutional failures that had contributed to the circumstances of Amber's death. Detective Trent Calloway received the Texas Department of Public Safety's Medal of Merit for his work on the case. In his acceptance speech, he dedicated the award to Catherine Rain and to the memory of Detective Mason Blackridge, who had passed away in 2020 without seeing the final resolution of the case that had defined much of his career. "Cold cases are never truly about the past," Calloway observed. "They're about bringing justice into the present for those who have waited far too long. The technological tools we use may evolve, but the fundamental work remains the same, following the evidence wherever it leads, giving voice to victims who can no longer speak for themselves, and holding accountable those who believed they were beyond the reach of justice." In Portland, Elaine Vernon finalized her divorce and changed her name back to her maiden name, Elaine Donovan. In interviews, she expressed shock and horror at discovering the truth about the man she had married. "I lived with a stranger for 11 years, she said. "Someone who could compartmentalize a murder so completely that he built an entire life, a marriage, a business on that foundation of deception. I've had to reconsider every moment of our relationship, wondering what was real and what was part of his performance as Neil Vernon." Forensic psychologists studying the case noted the remarkable compartmentalization Vance had demonstrated. His ability to separate his past crime from his new identity so completely that he functioned as a respected professional and community member for over 2 decades. What makes this case particularly disturbing from a psychological perspective, noted Dr. Mariam Jawad, a forensic psychologist who reviewed the case files, is not just the original crime, but the calculated reinvention that followed. Vance didn't merely flee. He methodically constructed a new identity and lived within it so convincingly that no one suspected his true nature. This level of sustained deception requires a profound moral disconnect that we rarely see even in career criminals. In October 2022, exactly 28 years after Amber's murder, Catherine Rain visited the site in Copper Canyon where her daughter's remains had been found. The area, now part of a state nature preserve, had been marked with a small memorial plaque at Catherine's request. She placed flowers at the site and spent several hours there alone, finally able to say goodbye, with the knowledge that justice, though decades delayed, had ultimately been served. Later that day, she visited Detective Calloway at the Lakewood Creek Police Department. She brought with her a small box containing a silver microscope pendant, the one Amber had been wearing in the flyers distributed after her disappearance. This was her favorite piece of jewelry, Catherine explained, her voice steady despite the emotion of the day. She wore it as a reminder of her commitment to science and truth. I think she would want you to have it now. Calloway accepted the pendant with visible emotion. This will hang in our cold case unit, he promised, as a reminder that no case is ever truly closed until justice is served, no matter how many years it takes. Udo, as Catherine Rain left the police station for the final time, she paused to look back at the building where her daughter's case had begun and ended. 28 years, she said softly, almost a decade longer than Amber was alive. But now she can rest, and so can I. But the story of Amber Rain and Nathaniel Vance entered the annals of criminal justice as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the evolution of forensic science. It demonstrated how advances in DNA analysis, toxicology, and digital investigation could reach across decades to solve cases once considered unsolvable. It showed how a single determined investigator, armed with new tools and perspectives, could bring closure to a case that had haunted a community for a generation. Most importantly, it served as a reminder that the passage of time does not erase the truth, that secrets, no matter how deeply buried or carefully hidden, eventually find their way to the surface. For Nathaniel Vance, this truth arrived after 28 years of borrowed freedom, in the form of a life sentence that finally delivered justice for the brilliant young woman whose future he had stolen on a September night in 1994. At Huntsville State Penitentiary, Vance's days now follow the monotonous rhythm of prison life, a stark contrast to the carefully constructed freedom he had enjoyed for so long. He works in the prison library, largely avoiding interaction with other inmates. He has refused all interview requests and rarely accepts visitors. Those who observe him note that he appears to have aged rapidly since his incarceration, the weight of his exposed truth finally visible on his face. Meanwhile, in Lubbock, Catherine Rain has found a measure of peace. She volunteers with organizations supporting families of victims in unsolved cases, sharing her story as evidence that justice, though sometimes delayed, is still possible. She keeps a photograph of Amber on her bedside table, not the formal portrait used in news coverage of the case, but a candid shot of her daughter laughing in a laboratory, microscope in hand, eyes bright with the promise of discoveries yet to come. Justice delayed, she often says, is still justice. And the truth, no matter how long buried, will always find its way into the light.